The lash cut through the silence of the marble hall, a sound as sharp and ugly as the laughter that followed it. Catherine Vance didn't scream. She lay crumpled on the priceless Persian rug, the thin silk of her evening gown ripped at the shoulder, her body braced for the next blow. Her husband Jonathan stood over her, his face a mask of cold fury, the riding crop a dark line in his hand. But the worst sound wasn't the whip. It was the musical, mocking laughter of his mistress Victoria Croft, who watched from a velvet armchair, swirling a glass of champagne. She was entertained. This was her theatre. And in that moment, as the third strike seared across Catherine's back, the grand oak doors of the drawing room swung silently open. The Vance estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, was a monument to new money clawing its way toward old-world legitimacy. A sprawling stone mansion named Greygate. It was all manicured lawns, imposing Doric columns, and interiors curated by a designer whose name was whispered with reverence in the pages of architectural magazines. To the outside world, Jonathan and Catherine Vance were the estate's perfect occupants. He was the brilliant, handsome executive vice president at Sterling Global, the multi-billion-dollar logistics empire founded and still ruthlessly run by his father-in-law, William Sterling. She was the beautiful, elegant, and demure wife, a perfect hostess, and a quiet patron of the arts. Their photographs graced society pages a toast at the Met Gala, a shared smile at a charity polo match, a hand-in-hand stroll through Aspen. But inside Greygate, the air was as thin and cold as the mountaintop. The love Catherine had once believed in had long since curdled into a possessive, suffocating control. Jonathan, the charming suitor, who had quoted poetry and promised her the world had revealed his true nature shortly after the wedding vows were exchanged. He was a man pathologically insecure, terrified of living in the shadow of her father. He saw the Sterling name not as a partnership, but as a brand he had to conquer. And he conquered it by attempting to break its air. The cruelty began subtly. A dismissive comment about her opinion in front of guests, a joke about her weight that was anything but. He isolated her from her old friends, deeming them unsuitable for their new station. He monitored her calls, screened her emails, and allocated her an allowance as if she were a child, despite her own family's immense wealth. Catherine, who had been raised to be gracious and to avoid conflict, found herself retreating inward. She made excuses for him. It was the pressure of work. It was his difficult childhood. She clung to the memory of the man she thought she had married, hoping he would one day reappear from behind the monster he had become. Then came Victoria Croft. Victoria was everything Catherine was not. Loud, brazen, and dripping with a predatory sensuality. She was a marketing consultant Jonathan had hired for a new subsidiary, and from the moment she entered their lives, she made her intentions clear. She didn't just want Jonathan. She wanted Catherine's life. She wanted the Vance name, the Greygate estate, and the proximity to the Sterling power she craved. Jonathan didn't bother to hide the affair. In his twisted mind, it was another tool of control, another way to humiliate his wife and prove his dominance. He brought Victoria to their home under the guise of late-night work sessions. He would praise Victoria's sharp business acumen in front of Catherine, contrasting it with Catherine's domestic sensibilities. Catherine would sit through excruciating dinners, listening to the woman sleeping with her husband, laugh at his jokes, touch his arm, and look at her with an expression of triumphant pity. Catherine's pleas for him to stop were met with cold threats. "Don't you dare embarrass me, Kate," he would hiss when they were alone. "Your father may own the company, but in this house I own you. Your life is perfect. Don't make me ruin it. The threat was always implicit. He would create a scandal so vile it would tarnish the sterling name, a name her father protected with the ferocity of a king guarding his kingdom. And so Catherine endured. She played the part of the perfect wife, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The evening it all shattered began like any other. Jonathan was hosting a small private dinner for a potential investor, a German industrialist named Klaus Richter. Catherine had overseen every detail, the floral arrangements, the 5-course menu from their private chef, the precise vintage of Bordeaux to be served. She moved through the evening with practiced grace, a beautiful automaton smiling in all the right places. Victoria was there, of course, seated to Jonathan's right ostensibly as his key marketing strategist. She wore a blood-red dress that left little to the imagination, her eyes glittering with malice every time they met Catherine's. Throughout the dinner, Jonathan subtly undermined Catherine at every turn. When she offered an opinion on a recent art acquisition, he chuckled and said, "Darling, let's stick to what you know, shall we, table settings and charities." Victoria had smirked into her wine glass. When Klaus Richter complimented the estate, Jonathan had draped an arm over Victoria's chair and said, "Victoria has some incredible ideas for redecorating, a more modern vision." Catherine felt a familiar cold dread pool in her stomach, but she held her head high, her posture perfect, her expression serene. This was her armor. After the investor had departed, promising a follow-up, the fragile peace of the evening shattered. The front door had barely clicked shut when Jonathan turned on her, his face dark with rage. "What was that?" he snarled. Catherine was genuinely confused. What was what, Jonathan? The evening went perfectly. "Don't play dumb with me," he snapped, advancing on her. "The way you looked at him, the way you were trying to engage him in conversation, you were undermining me." "I was being a hostess," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I was making our guest feel welcome." Victoria, who had been freshening her drink at the bar, sauntered over. "Oh, darling, it was a little more than that," she purred, her voice dripping with poison. "You looked so desperate for attention. It was rather pathetic." "This has nothing to do with you, Victoria," Catherine said, her control finally starting to fray. Jonathan grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin. "She is my guest, in my house. You will show her respect." His eyes were wild. His breath smelled of expensive whiskey. "You think you're so untouchable, don't you? With your perfect breeding and your father's name. But you're nothing without it. You're nothing without me." He was seething, spiraling into one of the rages she had come to fear more than anything. He dragged her from the foyer into the grand drawing room, the one with the soaring ceilings and the massive fireplace. Hanging above the mantel was a collection of antique riding crops, a pretentious affectation from a man who had been on a horse twice in his life. He reached up and took one down a thin, cruel-looking thing of braided black leather. Catherine's blood ran cold. It had never gone this far before. "Jonathan, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please." "You need to be taught a lesson, Catherine," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "A lesson in humility. You need to remember your place." He shoved her hard. She stumbled, catching her heel on the edge of the rug and falling to her knees on the floor. Her carefully constructed composure crumbled, replaced by a raw, primal fear. From her armchair, Victoria Croft picked up her champagne flute, took a delicate sip, and settled in to watch the show. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated pleasure. This was the ultimate victory for her. This was the final, absolute humiliation of the woman whose life she intended to steal. Jonathan raised the crop. The world narrowed to the space between Catherine's body and the braided leather whip in her husband's hand. The vast drawing room with its collection of priceless art and antique furniture felt like a cage, the air thick with the scent of whiskey and Victoria's cloying perfume was suffocating. Every muscle in Catherine's body tensed, a scream lodging itself in her throat, silent and sharp. "Please, Jonathan," she begged, her voice a fractured whisper. "Don't do this." His face was unreadable, a mask of chilling indifference. "A wife should be obedient," he stated, as if reading from a Victorian-era manual on marriage. "You have forgotten that." The first blow came without further warning. It wasn't a full-force strike, but a sharp, stinging cut across her shoulders. The pain was electric, shocking her system. It tore through the thin silk of her gown, a line of fire against her skin. A choked gasp escaped her lips, but she bit down hard on her tongue, tasting blood, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a scream. And then she heard it. Laughter. It wasn't a giggle or a snicker. It was a full, throaty, musical laugh from Victoria. She was leaning forward in the armchair, her red lips parted in a wide, predatory smile, her eyes sparkling with amusement. She raised her champagne flute in a mock toast. "Bravo, Johnny," she purred. "A man who knows how to handle his affairs." That sound, more than the physical pain, broke something inside Catherine. The humiliation was absolute, a corrosive acid dissolving the last vestiges of her hope. She wasn't just being assaulted by her husband. She was the evening's entertainment for his mistress. This wasn't about a lesson. This was a spectacle of degradation orchestrated for an audience of one. Jonathan's lips twisted into a cruel smirk, fueled by Victoria's approval. He felt powerful. He felt in control. He raised the crop again, this time with more force. The whip sliced through the air with a vicious whistle before landing with a sickening crack against her back, lower this time near her waist. This time a pained cry was torn from her throat. She crumpled forward, her hands splayed on the intricate patterns of the rug, her forehead pressing against the cool, unforgiving fibers. Tears welled hot and furious, but she refused to let them fall. She would not weep for them. She would not give them her tears. "See," Jonathan said, his voice laced with a triumphant sneer directed at Victoria. "It's all about communication, establishing boundaries." "Oh, I see the boundaries very clearly," Victoria replied, her voice husky with excitement. "She's on the floor and you're standing over her. It's wonderfully primal." He took a step closer, the shadow of his body falling over Catherine. He was enjoying this feeding off Victoria's perverse encouragement. The man she had once loved was completely gone, replaced by this sadistic monster. He was about to strike again, the whip raised for a third time, when a sound from the hallway interrupted the twisted tableau. It was the soft, almost imperceptible click of the grand oak doors opening. Neither Jonathan nor Victoria noticed at first. They were too engrossed in their sick theatre. Jonathan brought the crop down with a final vicious snap that ripped the silk of her dress and left a burning weal on her skin. It was at that precise moment that a voice as cold and hard as granite echoed through the cavernous room. "Jonathan!" The single word cut through the air with the force of a guillotine. It was not loud, but it carried an authority that was absolute, a sound that vibrated with decades of unchecked power. Jonathan froze mid-swing, his arm still raised. His face, which had been a mask of smug cruelty, went slack with shock. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. Victoria's gleeful smile vanished, replaced by a look of stunned confusion. She slowly lowered her champagne glass, her eyes darting towards the doorway. Catherine, still on the floor, squeezed her eyes shut. She thought she was imagining it. It couldn't be. He was supposed to be in Zurich until the end of the week. Slowly she lifted her head. Standing in the arched doorway was her father, William Sterling. He was not a physically imposing man, but he possessed an aura of such immense, condensed power that he seemed to take up all the oxygen in the room. He was dressed impeccably in a dark, tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He held a leather briefcase in one hand, but it was his eyes that held them all captive. They were a pale, icy blue, and they were fixed on the scene before him with an expression of such profound, glacial fury that it seemed to drop the temperature of the room by 20 degrees. He took in the entire scene. In a fraction of a second, his daughter crumpled on the floor in a torn gown, his son-in-law standing over her with a whip in his hand, and the unfamiliar woman in the red dress looking on with sick amusement. His gaze lingered for a moment on the riding crop in Jonathan's hand, and a muscle in his jaw clenched, the only outward sign of the inferno raging within him. "I believe," William Sterling said, his voice dangerously soft as he took a deliberate step into the room, "that you have something that belongs to me." Jonathan's mind scrambled, trying to process the impossible situation. "William," he stammered, his voice cracking. He hastily tried to hide the whip behind his back, a pathetically guilty gesture. This isn't what it looks like. We were just having a disagreement." William's icy gaze flickered from Jonathan to Victoria, who now looked as if she'd swallowed her champagne glass. He dismissed her with a look of utter contempt, as if she were a piece of dirt on the floor, before his eyes settled back on Jonathan. "A disagreement." William repeated the words, dripping with sarcasm. He took another slow, deliberate step into the room. The sound of his polished leather shoes on the marble floor was like the ticking of a doomsday clock. "My daughter is on the floor, her dress is torn, and you are holding a whip. Explain to me, Jonathan, what kind of disagreement ends like this?" "It was a misunderstanding," Jonathan babbled, sweat beading on his forehead. "Kate she's overly emotional. She fell." Catherine watched her father. She saw him glance at her, and for a fleeting moment the icy fury in his eyes was replaced by a look of deep, gut-wrenching pain. It was the look of a father seeing his child broken. Then, just as quickly, the mask of cold rage snapped back into place. William walked past Jonathan as if he wasn't there. He knelt beside Catherine, his movements stiff but gentle. He didn't try to help her up. Instead, he simply placed a hand on her uninjured shoulder. His touch was warm and solid, an anchor in the swirling vortex of her pain and humiliation. "Catherine," he said, his voice now devoid of anger, filled only with a quiet, firm resolve. "Are you hurt?" She couldn't speak. She could only look into his eyes and give a slight, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation he needed. He stood up, turning to face his son-in-law. Jonathan, who had been a swaggering tyrant moments before, now looked like a schoolboy caught in a lie, shrinking under William's gaze. "Get out," William said. The command was absolute. "What? This is my house," Jonathan blustered, a pathetic attempt to reclaim some semblance of authority. William's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth, no humor. It was a terrifying sight. Let's clarify. The down payment for this house came from a trust I established for Catherine. The mortgage is secured against stock options in my company, which I granted you. The staff are paid by an account that I fund. So no Jonathan. This is my house. You are merely a guest whose welcome has just expired. Now get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret." He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Victoria, who had frozen in her chair. "You too, prostitute. Leave the champagne." The raw, undisguised contempt in his voice finally broke Victoria's paralysis. She scrambled out of the chair, her face a blotchy mess of shock and fear, and practically fled the room without a word. Jonathan stood his ground for a moment longer, his mind racing. "You can't do this, William. Think of the scandal. Think of the Sterling name." It was his last desperate card to play. William Sterling actually laughed, a short, sharp, mirthless sound. "You think I care about a scandal more than I care about my daughter? You have mistaken my priorities for your own. You have made a catastrophic miscalculation." He walked over to the bar, picked up the telephone, and dialed a number from memory. "Hello, Michael," he said into the receiver. "It's William Sterling. I need you to come to the Vance estate in Greenwich. Yes, now. And bring Dr. Evans with you. No, the police will not be necessary. Not yet. This is a private matter. I am handling it." He hung up the phone and turned back to Jonathan, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as a winter sea. "Your life as you know it," William Sterling said softly, "is over." The 20 minutes that followed were a silent, tension-filled eternity. Jonathan remained rooted to the spot, a statue of impotent fury and panic. William Sterling didn't speak to him or even look at him again. Instead, he retrieved a cashmere throw from a nearby sofa and gently draped it over Catherine's shoulders, shielding the torn fabric of her dress. He helped her to her feet and guided her to an armchair, the one opposite the one Victoria had just vacated, as if to cleanse the space by her presence. He then poured a glass of water from a crystal decanter and handed it to her. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold it. When Michael arrived, he was the personification of quiet competence. A man in his late 50s with graying temples and the watchful eyes of a man who had seen everything. He was William Sterling's head of personal security, a role that encompassed everything from bodyguard to private investigator to fixer. With him was Dr. Evans, a discreet family physician who carried a well-worn leather medical bag. William's instructions were clipped and precise. "Michael, escort Mr. Vance to the guest house. He is not to leave the property. He is not to use a phone. He is not to contact anyone. See to it personally." Michael simply nodded. "Sir." He turned to Jonathan. "Mr. Vance. This way, please." There was no menace in his tone, but the command was backed by an unspoken promise of overwhelming force. Jonathan, after a moment of sputtering protest, saw the futility of arguing. He was no match for the silent, formidable man before him, nor for the iron will of his father-in-law. Defeated, he allowed himself to be led from the room, casting one last hateful glare at Catherine. "Dr. Evans," William continued, his voice softening as he turned back to his daughter. "Please look after Catherine. Check her for any injuries." While the doctor tended to Catherine in the library, gently cleaning and dressing the angry red wheals on her back, William Sterling made a second phone call. This time it was to his legal team. The conversation was brief and brutal. He invoked clauses in Jonathan's employment contract and the prenuptial agreement clauses he himself had insisted upon. By dawn, Jonathan's access to all company accounts, emails, and properties would be revoked. His corporate credit cards would be declined. His assets, tied as they were to Sterling Global, would be frozen. William was not just dismantling a marriage. He was systematically dismantling a life. When the doctor had finished pronouncing that the cuts were superficial, but the emotional trauma was significant, she left a mild sedative for Catherine and departed as quietly as she had arrived. Catherine and her father were finally alone, surrounded by the opulent silence of the house that had become her prison. "I am so sorry, Catherine," William said, his voice thick with a raw emotion he rarely showed. He sat on the ottoman in front of her, his usual air of command replaced by a father's grief. "I never should have let him. I saw the signs. His ambition, I thought it would be good for the business. I never imagined he was a monster." "It's not your fault, Dad." Catherine whispered the words, scratching her throat. "I hid it. I was ashamed." "There is no shame in being a victim." He countered, his voice hardening again. "The shame belongs entirely to him, and he is going to learn the true meaning of that word." He looked at her, his icy eyes searching hers. "I can make this all go away, Catherine. We can send him away with nothing, a quiet divorce, a non-disclosure agreement. He will vanish from our lives, and you can begin again." Catherine looked around the library at the leather-bound books Jonathan had never read, the expensive art he'd bought for status, not for love. She thought of Victoria's mocking laughter, the searing pain of the whip, and the years of quiet humiliation that had preceded it. A quiet divorce wasn't enough. It wasn't justice. It was an escape. And she was done escaping. A new feeling was beginning to smolder beneath the pain and fear, a cold, hard, and utterly lucid rage. It was an unfamiliar sensation, but it was clarifying. It burned away the fog of denial she had lived in for so long. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "No, that's not enough. He can't just vanish. He and that woman. They can't just walk away from this and build a new life somewhere else. They enjoyed it, Dad. They thought it was a game." William watched her, a flicker of something new in his expression. It was respect. He was seeing not just his daughter, but a reflection of his own iron will, a trait he had long feared was absent in her. "Then what do you want?" he asked quietly. "I don't just want to divorce him," Catherine said, leaning forward, the pain in her back a dull throb that now seemed to fuel her resolve. "I want to ruin him. I want to ruin them both. I want to take away everything they have and everything they hope to be. I want them to know that I did it. I want them to feel as small and as helpless as they made me feel tonight." For the first time that night, William Sterling smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had just been given permission to hunt. "Good," he said. "That's the Sterling blood I was looking for. We won't just get revenge, Catherine. We will orchestrate a symphony of destruction." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the darkened, perfectly manicured lawns of the estate. "He made one fatal error beyond touching you. He used his position at Sterling Global as his power base. He flew too close to the sun, and he's about to find out that I own the sun." The plan began to form in that moment, not in a flurry of shouted commands, but in a quiet, calculated exchange. William would provide the resources, the best lawyers, the most ruthless forensic accountants, the most discreet private investigators. But he made one thing clear. Catherine would be the architect. This would be her war, and he would be her general. "He underestimated you," William said, turning back to face her. That will be his undoing. They both did. They saw a quiet, gentle woman. They didn't see the queen on the chessboard. It's time they did. Catherine took a deep breath, the sedative the doctor had given her, beginning to calm her trembling body. But it couldn't touch the icy resolve solidifying in her heart. She was no longer just Catherine Vance, the broken wife. She was Catherine Sterling, and a storm was gathering. A storm that would tear through the lives of Jonathan Vance and Victoria Croft, and leave nothing but wreckage in its wake. The dawn that was breaking over the perfectly trimmed hedges of Greygate would not bring a new day for them, but the beginning of a long, dark night. The next morning, Catherine left Greygate for the last time. She didn't pack a bag. She walked out of the front door with nothing but the clothes on her back, a simple silk blouse and trousers her father's assistant had brought, and didn't look back. The mansion was no longer her home. It was a crime scene, the mausoleum of her dead marriage. She was taken to her father's penthouse on Fifth Avenue, a stark, modern fortress of glass and steel overlooking Central Park. It was a world away from the stuffy, faux aristocratic grandeur of the Greenwich estate. Here the lines were clean, the spaces open, the air itself seeming to hum with purpose. This became her war room. For the first few days, Catherine focused on healing, not just the physical welts on her back, which faded from angry red to a mottled purple, but the deeper wounds inside. She slept, she ate, she spoke at length with a therapist who specialized in trauma and high-conflict relationships. The therapist helped her name the abuse she had endured for years: coercive control, gaslighting, emotional, and finally, physical violence. Giving it a name stripped it of its shadowy power. It wasn't a disagreement or a difficult marriage. It was a calculated campaign of abuse and understanding that transformed her shame into fuel. On the 5th day, she walked into her father's study, a room paneled in dark mahogany with a panoramic view of the city, and found him waiting with 2 other men. "Catherine, this is Daniel Finch," William said, indicating a man in a perfectly tailored but unassuming suit. "He is the head of our corporate legal department, and this," he said, gesturing to the second man, "is Mr. Davies." Mr. Davies was the more intriguing of the two. He was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of sharp angles and quiet intensity. He had the kind of nondescript face that was easy to forget, which Catherine immediately understood was a professional asset. His eyes, however, were unforgettable, sharp, analytical, and missing nothing. He didn't offer a handshake, just a slight, respectful nod. William had explained his background, earlier ex-MI6, now running one of the most exclusive and discreet corporate intelligence firms in the world. He was the man you hired when you needed to know where all the bodies were buried. "Catherine," William began his tone all business. "We have 2 primary targets, Vance and Croft. We will attack them on separate fronts. Finch will handle the legal and financial assault on Jonathan. Mr. Davies will handle the opposition research on both of them. I want you to direct them. They report to you now." Finch, a seasoned lawyer used to dealing with corporate titans, looked slightly surprised, but masked it quickly. Davies's expression didn't change at all. Catherine took her seat at the head of the large mahogany table. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the old insecurity, a voice whispering that she was out of her depth. Then she remembered Victoria's laughter, and the voice died. "Mr. Finch," she began, her voice clear and firm. "What is Jonathan's current status?" "Legally, he's in limbo," Finch replied, opening a sleek leather portfolio. "His employment is suspended pending an internal investigation. His assets are frozen, due to a preliminary injunction we filed citing potential misappropriation of company funds. The prenup is ironclad. In a divorce, he's entitled to a one-time payment of $500,000 and nothing more. He forfeits all claims to property stock and future earnings. That's not enough, Catherine said flatly. I don't want him to walk away with $500,000. I want him to walk away with debt and a criminal record. What's the basis for the misappropriation claim? It's a broad claim for now, Finch admitted. We're alleging he used company resources for personal gain. Lavish trips with Ms. Croft billed as business expenses, questionable consultancy fees. We need something more substantial to trigger a federal investigation. Then we find it, Catherine said, turning her attention to the other man. Mr. Davies, I want to know everything about Jonathan Vance. Every secret, every weakness, every dirty deal he's ever made. I was married to him for 5 years, but I have a feeling I never knew him at all. Then she turned her focus to the other target. And I want to know everything about Victoria Croft. She presented herself as a top-tier marketing genius from a good family in Boston. I never believed it. Find out who she really is, where she came from, what skeletons are in her closet. I want to know what she's most afraid of. Davies gave another slight nod. We have already begun. Standard preliminary sweeps. Ms. Croft's digital footprint is curated. Almost too perfect. A master's degree from Wharton, a series of successful positions at boutique firms. But the history is thin before that. It suggests a reinvention. We will find the original. And Mr. Vance, he's arrogant, Davies stated simply. Arrogant men get sloppy. They believe they are invincible. They leave tracks. We are currently analyzing all his communications through the company servers, his travel records, and his financial transactions going back 7 years. We are particularly interested in a shell corporation he set up 2 years ago, Vanguard Solutions. It received substantial payments from a subcontractor working on our new shipping terminal project in Rotterdam. Catherine's eyes narrowed. The Rotterdam project was one of Sterling Global's biggest initiatives, a multi-billion-dollar automated port facility. My father gave Jonathan significant oversight on that project. Precisely, Davies said. He had the authority to approve subcontractors and sign off on invoices. Arrogant men don't just steal petty cash. They go for the crown jewels. The strategy was set. It would be a two-pronged attack. The first prong, led by Finch, was the overt legal assault. The divorce, the employment termination, the civil suits. This was the battering ram that would break down his gates. The second covert prong, led by Davies, was the sword of Damocles. They would gather the evidence of his criminal activities, holding it back until the perfect moment. For Victoria, the plan was different, more personal, more insidious. She wants social status. Catherine mused aloud, more to herself than to the men in the room. She wants to be admired, to be envied. She clawed her way into our world. Ruining her financially won't be enough. We have to expel her. We have to make her a pariah. Social exile can be arranged, Davies said, his tone flat. Once we know who she truly is, we can ensure that the right people are made aware of it. The society columns can be just as brutal as a courtroom. Over the next 3 weeks, the penthouse became a command center. Catherine worked tirelessly, often late into the night. She shed the last remnants of the timid, passive woman she had been. The abuse had burned away her naivete, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. She was sharp-focused and utterly ruthless. She reviewed financial statements with Finch, spotting anomalies with an intuition that surprised the veteran lawyer. She analyzed surveillance reports from Davies's team, piecing together timelines and connecting disparate pieces of information. She learned that Jonathan was trapped at the guest house, cut off, and growing more desperate by the day, bombarding Finch's office with angry, threatening calls that were all meticulously recorded. She learned that Victoria had tried to contact him, but her calls were blocked. She was holed up in her luxury apartment, a lease paid for, by Jonathan's now frozen accounts, likely wondering why the money had suddenly stopped. Catherine was no longer a victim reacting to trauma. She was a strategist, a hunter. She was forging the sword of her own vengeance, and she was learning to wield it with terrifying precision. Every document she read, every report she analyzed, was another step towards the complete and utter annihilation of the two people who had tried to destroy her. She wasn't just taking back her life. She was preparing to burn theirs to the ground. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 4 weeks after the attack. Mr. Davies arrived at the penthouse not with a file, but with a single encrypted tablet. He placed it on the mahogany table in front of Catherine and her father. "We have them," he said without preamble. His usual stoic expression was tinged with a hint of professional satisfaction. He tapped the screen, bringing up a complex flowchart of bank accounts, shell corporations and wire transfers. It was a dizzying web of deception, but at its center were 2 names, Jonathan Vance, and a Rotterdam-based construction firm called Decker Heavy Industries. Vanguard Solutions, the shell company Vance set up, has one purpose. Davies explained, his finger tracing a line on the screen. Decker was awarded the primary contract for laying the foundation and concrete work at the new port terminal. A contract Vance approved. Over the past 18 months, Decker has systematically overbilled Sterling Global by 22%, citing unforeseen geological challenges and material cost overruns. Vance approved every single inflated invoice. "I remember those reports." William growled, his knuckles white as he gripped the arm of his chair. "I questioned them, but Jonathan produced geological surveys and supplier cost sheets to back them up. All forged, I assume." "Completely fabricated," Davies confirmed. The excess payments, totaling just over $34 million, were then funneled from Decker back to Vance through a series of offshore accounts, finally landing in the account of Vanguard Solutions. It was a classic kickback scheme, executed on a massive scale. Jonathan hadn't just been stealing from the company. He had been stealing directly from William Sterling's flagship project, using his trust as a weapon. "This is more than enough for a federal case," Finch said, peering at the tablet with a lawyer's hungry gaze. "Wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. He'll do serious time for this. 20 years, maybe more." Catherine felt a cold sense of victory, but she held up a hand. "Not yet. We don't go to the authorities yet." "What else did he use the money for?" Davies swiped the screen. A new set of images appeared. Photographs. Surveillance shots of Jonathan meeting with a shadowy figure in a Brussels hotel bar. Bank statements from Vanguard Solutions, showing a series of large, untraceable cash withdrawals. "He's been playing in a dangerous sandbox," Davies said. "He's been using a portion of the stolen funds to bribe port officials and union leaders to ensure there are no labor disputes or regulatory delays. He wasn't just stealing. He was using our own money to create a power base for himself to guarantee the project's success so he could look like a hero to your board of directors, Mr. Sterling. The man he was meeting with is a known fixer for the Russian syndicate in Antwerp. Jonathan is in far deeper than we ever imagined." The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. He had woven a web of criminality so deep within the fabric of her father's company that a public revelation could cause a catastrophic scandal potentially jeopardizing the entire Rotterdam project. Jonathan had built himself a poison pill. "He thinks this makes him untouchable," William said, his voice dangerously low. "He thinks if we expose him, we expose ourselves to the fallout." "He's wrong," Catherine said, her mind already working, seeing the path forward. "We don't detonate the bomb. We use it as leverage. We make him dismantle it for us, piece by piece." She then looked at Davies. "What about her?" Davies's face remained impassive, but he swiped to the final section of the report. It was titled Croft Victoria. Underneath, in smaller letters, was another name, Rachel Pinsky. The screen showed a grainy yearbook photo from a public high school in Cleveland, Ohio. The girl in the picture had the same eyes, but her hair was a mousy brown, and her face had a hardness that hadn't been polished away by expensive dermatologists. "Victoria Croft does not exist," Davies stated. "She was born Rachel Pinsky. Her father was a mechanic, her mother a waitress. She was not a Wharton graduate. She has 2 years of community college and a series of low-level marketing jobs in the Midwest. She also has a sealed juvenile record." He brought up a scanned police report. At 17, Rachel Pinsky had been charged with fraud and identity theft, part of a small-time credit card scam ring. The charges were dropped when she turned state's evidence against her boyfriend. "After that, she vanished," Davies continued. "She resurfaced 5 years later in New York as Victoria Croft with a fabricated resume and a new accent. She used her looks and a talent for manipulation to get a job at a small firm, then leveraged that to get a better one, and so on. She is a complete fraud, a con artist who has been playing a long game." The report included details of her life that were both pathetic and damning. Old debts, estranged family members who hadn't heard from her in a decade, a former roommate who described her as pathologically ambitious and completely devoid of a conscience. Her greatest fear, the report concluded, was exposure. Her entire identity was a house of cards built on whispers and lies. If someone were to blow on it, it would disintegrate. Catherine stared at the picture of the young, hard-faced girl from Cleveland. This was the woman who had laughed as she was being beaten. This was the parasite who wanted to steal her life. She felt no pity, only a cold, clear purpose. "Mr. Davies," Catherine said, "I want you to package this information. Everything on Rachel Pinsky. Not the criminal allegations against Jonathan, just the information about her. Create a dossier. Make it anonymous, untraceable." "And to whom shall I send it?" Davies asked. Catherine smiled, a chilling, predatory expression that her father recognized instantly. It was his smile. "To everyone," she said. "We'll start with Brenda Carlyle at the New York Ledger. Her society gossip column, Carlyle's Court, is the Bible of the world Victoria so desperately wants to belong to. Then we'll leak it to the board members of the charities she sits on, to the other consultants at her firm. We won't just expose her. We will make her name, both of her names, synonymous with scandal and deceit." The plan was now complete. They had the financial and criminal leverage to utterly destroy Jonathan. They had the personal, humiliating truth to decimate Victoria. But Catherine knew the final act couldn't happen in a courtroom or a boardroom. It had to be face-to-face. She needed to be the one to watch the light go out in their eyes. The storm was no longer gathering. It was about to break. The first strike was surgical and silent. A plain manila envelope with no return address was delivered by messenger to Brenda Carlyle's office at the New York Ledger. Inside was the meticulously prepared dossier on Victoria Croft, a.k.a. Rachel Pinsky. It contained the yearbook photocopies of the old police report and a short typed summary of her fraudulent history. It was an anonymous tip, a journalist's dream. 3 days later, Carlisle's court ran a devastating front-page story under the headline, "Social Climbers, Shocking Secret, the Two Faces of Victoria Croft." The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It painted a picture of a calculating grifter from Ohio who had conned her way into the city's elite circles. It detailed her fabricated education, her invented family history, and hinted at a sordid criminal past. By noon, the story was everywhere, a viral firestorm burning through the social and professional networks Victoria had spent years cultivating. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Her consulting firm, terrified of the scandal, terminated her contract, citing a morals clause. The boards of the two prestigious charities she had fought so hard to join called emergency meetings and summarily voted her out. Invitations to upcoming galas and events were rescinded via terse emails. The friends who had once flocked to her side now crossed the street to avoid her. She was no longer Victoria Croft, the glamorous marketing guru. She was Rachel Pinsky, the fraud from Cleveland. In a world built on reputation and perception, her identity had been executed. Davies's team reported that she had not left her apartment in days, the final rent payment was due, and eviction proceedings were imminent. While Victoria's world imploded publicly, the second phase of the plan began privately. Daniel Finch requested a meeting with Jonathan and his lawyer. They met not in a law office, but in the cold, impersonal conference room of a neutral third-party mediator. Jonathan walked in with a belligerent swagger, though Catherine, watching via a hidden camera feed from her father's study, could see the fear in his eyes. He had been isolated for weeks, his funds cut off, his power stripped away. He was a king with no kingdom. "What is this about Finch?" he blustered. "If Catherine thinks she's getting a dime more than the prenup stipulates, she's insane." Finch didn't respond. Instead, he placed a single thick file on the table. "This is a copy of your divorce settlement, Mr. Vance. We've taken the liberty of drafting it. Please read it carefully." Jonathan's lawyer, a slick but ultimately outmatched attorney named Peterson, picked it up. As he read, his professional composure began to crumble. His eyes widened, and he paled slightly. "This is outrageous," Peterson stammered, looking up. "You're demanding he forfeit the $500,000 settlement. You're demanding he sign over his pension, his 401k, and the title to the Greenwich property free and clear. You're demanding he assume liability for a personal debt of $5 million payable to Ms. Sterling. This is punitive. No judge would ever approve this." "We won't be going to a judge," Finch said calmly. He slid a second, much thinner file across the table. "This is for you, Mr. Vance. A little light reading." Jonathan snatched the file and opened it. Inside were not legal documents, but a series of photographs and bank statements. The first was a surveillance photo of him meeting the Russian fixer in Brussels. The next was a summary of the wire transfers from Decker Heavy Industries to Vanguard Solutions. The final page was a simple, one-paragraph summary of the federal crimes he had committed: wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and bribery of foreign officials. Jonathan stared at the papers, his face turning the color of ash. The swagger evaporated, replaced by the stark animal terror of a trapped man. He looked from the file to Finch, his mouth opening and closing silently. "As you can see," Finch continued, his voice as smooth as silk, "we have a choice to make. Option A. You sign the divorce settlement as written. You walk away with nothing but the clothes you're wearing and a substantial legally binding debt to your ex-wife. You will then spend the next 6 months cooperating fully with our internal audit to help us uncover and rectify the financial irregularities at the Rotterdam terminal. You will help us quietly remove the people you bribed and ensure a smooth transition. In return for your full cooperation, this file—" He tapped the evidence, "remains a private internal matter." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle in the room. "Or option B," Finch said, his voice turning to ice. "You refuse, in which case a copy of this file goes directly to the U.S. Attorney's Office and another copy goes to the Dutch authorities. Your assets, what's left of them, will be seized as proceeds of crime. You will be arrested, and given the evidence, I imagine you will spend the better part of your adult life in a federal prison. Peterson, I trust you can advise your client on the sentencing guidelines for these particular offenses." Peterson looked like he was going to be sick. He could only nod mutely. Jonathan was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. He had been so clever, so arrogant, convinced his poison pill scheme made him invincible. He never imagined they would find everything. He never imagined they would be willing to use it with such brutal precision. "She did this," he rasped, his voice filled with venom. "Catherine did this. Ms. Sterling has taken a keen interest in rectifying the damage you have caused her and her family's company." Finch replied coolly. "You have 1 hour to decide. The clock is ticking." There was no choice to make. It was a checkmate. An hour later, a defeated, broken Jonathan Vance signed every document placed in front of him, effectively signing away his entire life. But Catherine knew it wasn't over. The legal and financial destruction was complete, but the emotional reckoning was yet to come. She had one final act to play. 2 days later, she arranged for Jonathan to be brought to Greygate. She wanted the final confrontation to happen in the room where her nightmare had begun. When he was shown into the grand drawing room, he found her standing by the fireplace, calmly looking at the spot on the rug where she had fallen. The riding crop was no longer on the mantel. She was dressed in a simple but powerful dark blue dress. She looked different. The fear and uncertainty were gone, replaced by a formidable calm. "Hello, Jonathan," she said, her voice even. "What do you want, Kate?" he snarled. "Haven't you done enough? You've taken everything." "I haven't taken anything you didn't steal first," she countered, turning to face him. "The money, the house, the life you built, it was all a fraud, just like you. I loved you once," he said, a pathetic, desperate attempt to find a crack in her armor. Catherine laughed. It wasn't the hysterical, mocking laughter of Victoria Croft. It was a cold, pitying sound. "No, you didn't. You loved the idea of me. You loved my name, my father's money. You loved the status I gave you. But you hated me. You hated that you needed me, that you would always be in my father's shadow. And so you tried to break me, to make me smaller, so you could feel big." She took a step toward him. "But you failed. You didn't break me. You woke me up. You and that pathetic grifter you brought into our home." "Don't talk about her," he spat. "Why not?" "Are you worried about Rachel Pinsky?" Catherine asked, enjoying the flicker of shock on his face as she used the name. "I hear she's having a difficult time. Evicted from her apartment yesterday, I believe. All her credit cards were in your name after all. It must be so difficult to go from champagne and charity galas back to being a nobody from Cleveland with a criminal record." She walked past him, heading for the door. "This is the last time you will ever see this house, Jonathan. This is the last time you will ever see me. Tomorrow, your cooperation with my father's company begins. And I assure you they will work you until they have extracted every last piece of useful information. And then you'll be left with nothing. Not even a name people will remember. Just a $5 million debt you'll never be able to repay." She paused at the doorway, turning back for one last look at the man who had tormented her. He looked small and pathetic, lost in the vastness of the room he had once commanded. "You wanted to teach me my place," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But all you did was help me find my own. Goodbye, Jonathan." She walked out without looking back, leaving him alone in the silent monument to his own destruction. The unraveling was complete. In the aftermath, the silence left by the storm was profound. Jonathan Vance, as promised, became a ghost. To avoid prison, he was forced to help dismantle the web of fraud he had created, only to be cast aside by Sterling Global once his usefulness expired. He vanished from public life, a disgraced man with an insurmountable debt erased from the world he fought to conquer. Victoria Croft's demise was more public. As Rachel Pinsky, she was a pariah. The social circles she'd infiltrated slammed their doors, leaving her unemployable and destitute. Her punishment was to live as a bitter shadow forever, on the outside of a life she'd only pretended to have. Catherine, however, did not retreat into a quiet life. She reclaimed her maiden name and her power. Refusing to be a mere heiress, she took a leading role at Sterling Global, creating a new ethics division to rebuild the integrity Jonathan had shattered. She excelled her personal experience with deceit, giving her an unmatched insight that earned the respect of veteran executives. She sold the Greenwich estate, exorcising its ghosts, and used the funds to establish the Sterling Foundation for Victims of Domestic Abuse, transforming her personal trauma into a public shield. A year later, looking out over the London skyline, Catherine was finally whole. The scars on her back had faded reminders not of pain, but of the strength she had forged in the fire. The revenge was not just about justice, it was a reclamation. She hadn't just destroyed her enemies. She had built a new world from the ashes, one where she was no longer a victim in a cage, but the powerful architect of her own destiny. And so Catherine Sterling's story isn't just one of revenge. It's a testament to the incredible strength that can be forged in the fiercest of fires. It's about how the deepest betrayals can sometimes awaken a power within us we never knew we possessed. She didn't just get even. She rose above transforming her personal tragedy into a source of strength and a beacon of hope for others. Her journey reminds us that the ultimate victory isn't just in watching your enemies fall, but in building a better life from the rubble they left behind. If this story of resilience, justice, and ultimate triumph resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates a story of strength overcoming adversity. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell for more gripping stories like this one. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful narratives to life. Thank you for listening.